Welcome to Reformed Thinking. I am your host, and it's great to be back here with you as we get ready to open up the archives of church history once again.
Good to be here.
As you listening know, we're two guys who hold to the Westminster Confession. We love the doctrines of grace, and we're convinced that theology isn't just for, dusty library shelves.
No, it's for real life. It has to be. What you believe about God, it really does shape everything else.
It does, and usually we take a specific doctrine, maybe a Bible verse, and we pull it apart piece by piece.
But today we're doing something a little different. We're looking at a man.
A man who, let's be honest, has a bit of a reputation. We are talking about John Calvin.
Just saying the name gets a reaction.
It does. And for us, and probably for a lot of you listening, the name Calvin triggers, a few specific associations. You might think of the sovereignty of God, maybe the Geneva,
Yeah,
of
sure.
course. But generally, I think people see him as the exclusive property of the Presbyterian Church.
That's the standard view. He's the Presbyterian guy. If you're not one, you might look at him with a bit of suspicion. Or maybe you just ignore him altogether.
And that, right there, is the hook for today's deep dive. We're looking at a stack of source material, specifically from David W. Hall's book, The Legacy of John Calvin. And this material just flips that whole assumption on its head.
It really does.
The twist is that these sources show Calvin doesn't just belong to the Presbyterian.
No, not even close.
We're going to see today that Calvin's influence, it sort of jumps the fence of Geneva and finds these champions, these advocates among Baptists,
Anglicans.
Independents, Methodists, and this is the one that really got me, even some Roman Catholics.
It's a pretty striking collection of tributes when you see them all together. And what matters for our discussion, what we really want to get into, is not just patting Calvin on the back. We want to figure out why.
Yes, the why. Why does a Baptist giant like Charles Spurgeon physically kiss a medal of John Calvin? That's just bizarre on the surface.
It is. Or why does an Anglican bishop say the Church of England should, and I'm quoting here, go to pieces, rather than lose Calvin's doctrine? What's going on there?
That is the mission for today. We're going to try to look at Calvin through the eyes of these outsiders, people who, technically didn't share his church government or maybe every single aspect of his practice, to see what it was they saw in him.
Right. And just to be clear before we start, we're looking at historical tributes, mostly from the 19th and 20th centuries.
Right. And some of this praise is incredibly high. So our job is just to report on it, to convey what we're finding in the historical record. We're not necessarily endorsing every word, but reporting what was said.
That's it. We're just looking at the evidence of how these major figures viewed the reformer.
Okay, let's get right into it. And we're starting with a real heavyweight. Section 1 takes us to the 19th century and the Prince of Preachers.
The Baptist giant himself.
Charles Haddon Spurgeon.
A man who, needs no introduction if you're in the English-speaking evangelical world.
And if you know anything about Spurgeon, you know he was a Bible man. He wasn't big on tradition. He certainly didn't care for high church rituals or anything like that.
No, he was a nonconformist through and through.
Yeah.
A dissenter to the bone.
Okay, so with that in mind, can you please explain to me why, in the summer of 1860, Charles Spurgeon is standing in a cathedral in Geneva and he physically kisses a medal of John Calvin?
It's a jarring image, isn't it? It just doesn't compute with the Spurgeon we think we know.
It's so weird. It sounds like something he would preach a sermon against.
It does. But you have to understand the context of what he called his Genevan pilgrimage. He'd been working himself into the ground in London. It was, believe it or not, his first real holiday in 7 years.
7 years? Without a break?
7 years. He was preaching multiple times a week, running an orphanage, a college, editing a magazine. He was completely burnt out.
Wow.
So he finally takes a break, travels to the continent, and he makes his way to Geneva. He goes to the Cathedral of St. Peter, Calvin's home base. And someone there shows him this medal.
And he just kisses it.
He just kisses it. He writes about it later. The first time I saw the medal of John Calvin, I kissed it.
But why? Was it some kind of superstition? That seems so out of character.
No. And he's very quick to clarify that. He says he wasn't engaging in idolatry. It wasn't like a holy relic that had some kind of magical power. For him, it was an act of, desperate affection.
Affection for a man who'd been dead for 300 years.
Affection for his spiritual father. You have to remember, Spurgeon felt incredibly isolated in his day. He was fighting these huge theological battles in London, what became known as the downgrade controversy, and he felt almost entirely alone.
So when he held that medal,
He was touching his lineage. He was making a connection. He was reminding himself that he wasn't some kind of theological freak of nature, that he was part of a family tree. He said he loved the man because he saw in Calvin the very same truth he was fighting for back home.
when you put it that way, it's actually quite a moving story. It's this moment of connection across the centuries for a guy who felt all alone.
It is. And the people in Geneva, they loved it. They were so taken with him that they invited him to preach
In Calvin's pulpit.
in the very spot,
Yeah.
the pulpit at St. Peter's where the Reformation was thundered out. But then they hit a snag.
The clothes.
The clothes. The dreaded Genevan gown.
I've read about this, the full canonicals.
Yeah, you have to picture this. Spurgeon is a British Baptist. He preaches in a simple frock coat. He doesn't do robes. He doesn't do vestments. It's not his world.
Right.
But the Genevans insisted. They basically said, if you want to stand in Calvin's pulpit, you have to look the part.
So they actually dressed him up.
They put him in the gown, and Spurgeon, he hated it. He said he felt like he was running in a sack.
Running in a sack. That is such a perfect Spurgeon phrase. So vivid.
Isn't it? He felt silly. He felt restricted. But, and this is the key insight into his thinking, he wore it anyway. And do you know why he finally agreed?
Tell me.
He said, it was John Calvin's cloak, and that reconciled me to it very much.
Wow. Just slap.
So he was willing to be physically uncomfortable, willing to look a bit foolish in his own eyes because of the honor of standing in that man's shoes, so to speak.
He even made a joke about it, didn't he?
He did, which shows his quick wit. He said something like, if they had asked him to wear the Pope's tiara, he might have done it just to be polite. But the cloak, that was different. He wore that with a sense of genuine reverence.
That one story really drives home the whole point of our discussion today. We think of denominations as these, rigid walls. Baptists over here, Presbyterians over there. But here's Spurgeon climbing right over the wall because he recognizes the theology is the same.
You hit the nail on the head. And that theology wasn't just a professional interest for him. It was deeply personal. It was part of his home life, which brings us to his library.
Right. W.Y. Fullerton, who was one of his biographers, he notes that among the books Spurgeon valued the most were Calvin's works. And there's a really personal detail about his set of Calvin's commentaries.
A very personal detail. They were a gift. In the front of the first volume, there's an inscription.
What does it say?
It says, the volumes making up a complete set of Calvin were a gift to me from my own most dear and tender wife.
From his wife, Susanna. That gives you a little glimpse into the Spurgeon household, doesn't it? It wasn't just, here's a tool for your job, dear.
No, not at all. It was more like, here is food for your soul. It shows that this theology was the very air they breathed together. It was part of their marriage.
And that deep love for the content, it actually shaped his preaching style. Fullerton makes this fascinating comparison between Spurgeon and Calvin as preachers.
Which is surprising because we often think of Calvin as this dry, academic, systematic lecturer, and Spurgeon as the colorful, passionate orator.
Right, they seem like opposites. But Fullerton argues they're actually very similar in a key way.
And how's that?
It comes down to the language they used. Fullerton has this great phrase for it. He calls it the picturesque language of colloquial social intercourse.
Okay, that's a bit of a mouthful.
It is, but it basically just means they spoke the way real people speak. They weren't afraid to be earthy. They weren't afraid to be blunt, even a bit vulgar if it got the point across.
So if a common word grabbed the audience's attention better than a polished classical Latin word, they'd use the common word every time.
Exactly. The source gives a brilliant example of this from one of Calvin's own sermons. We picture biblical figures in Calvin's sermons as being very stoic and formal. But Calvin imagines Moses complaining about having to climb Mount Sinai.
Oh, this is great, yes. He pictures Moses grumbling, saying something like, that's all very fine, and I'm to go and break my legs climbing up there, am I? Of all things in the world, that's a fine prospect.
I'm to go and break my legs. That sounds like something my grumpy grandfather would say, not a revered prophet of God.
But that's the whole point, isn't it?
Yeah.
Calvin made these people real. He brought them down to earth.
He did. And Spurgeon did the very same thing. They both preferred the vernacular, the language of the street, over the classical language of the academy. They wanted to penetrate the conscience, not just tickle the ear with fancy words.
Fullerton notes that Calvin despised what he called ostentatious eloquence. He wanted the message to hit home hard.
It's the difference between, say, a lecture on nutrition and a hot meal. They were serving hot meals from the pulpit.
And that meal was fueled by a very specific theology. And we have to talk about how Spurgeon came to that theology, his own conversion to Reformed doctrine.
Oh, this is a classic story. The source material quotes Spurgeon recalling the very day he realized the truth of these doctrines. It was April 7th, 1850.
And you should notice the logic he uses. It's a perfect example of how this system of thought works. He's sitting in church, not really paying attention to the sermon, and he starts to trace his own spiritual history backwards.
He starts with the question, how came I to be a Christian? And his first answer is, I sought the Lord.
But he doesn't stop there. That's the key. He keeps asking why.
Right. He asks, but how came I to seek the Lord? And the answer flashes into his mind. I should not have sought him unless there had been some previous influence in my mind to make me seek him.
He just keeps pulling on that thread. I prayed. Okay, how came I to pray?
I was induced to pray by reading the scriptures.
Okay, but how came I to read the scriptures? And he keeps going back and back until the final conclusion just hits him like a ton of bricks.
God was at the bottom of it all.
God was at the bottom of it all. He saw in that moment that God was the author of his faith from beginning to end. And in that moment, the whole doctrine of grace just opened up to him. He realized that if he were a Pelagian...
Okay, you mentioned Pelagian there. For the listener who hasn't, dusted off their seminary textbooks in a while, can you break that down for us?
Sure. Pelagianism is, at its core, the idea that human beings are capable of choosing God entirely on their own, without any special prior work of grace. It's the ultimate pull yourself up by your own bootstraps theology. You save yourself by your own free will.
So Spurgeon realizes that if he believes in free will in that way, he's basically standing all by himself in church history.
Correct. He says if he's a Pelagian, he stands with a few scattered heretics. But by accepting God's sovereignty and salvation, he looks around and he sees father after father, confessor after confessor, martyr after martyr, standing up to shake his hand. He's part of the great tradition.
That image of walking alone versus walking with the fathers is so powerful. He says, I care not for the present. He's looking to the past for his confirmation.
And that leads to one of the most famous analogies in all of church history about this very subject, the sugar and tea analogy.
I love this one.
So good. Spurgeon is talking to his students at the pastor's college. He references John Newton, the man who wrote Amazing Grace. He says Newton put Calvinism in his sermons the way you put sugar into a cup of tea.
Meaning you don't necessarily see the big lump of sugar anymore.
Right. It dissolves, but it flavors the whole thing. It's everywhere in the cup. You can't take a single sip without tasting it. The whole sermon is sweetened with the sovereignty of God.
And then Spurgeon adds his own little twist, his own advice to his students.
He does. He tells them, don't be afraid of putting in an extra lump now and then.
Don't be afraid to be explicit about it, to state the doctrine clearly.
Spot on. Spurgeon did not view what we call Calvinism as some kind of sectarian side issue. He famously said it's just a nickname for the revealed truth of God as it is in Christ Jesus.
So for him, it wasn't a denomination. It was just the gospel in its purest, most consistent form.
That's how he saw it. And that explains everything. It explains why a Baptist like Spurgeon would kiss the metal of a Presbyterian like Calvin. They were fighting for the same gospel.
Okay, that's a great place to start. Let's move across the ocean now. Section 2 takes us to the American South. We're looking at the intellectual weight of some of the early Southern Baptists.
And this is really interesting because often people associate the Southern Baptist Convention with a more revivalist and maybe a less self-consciously reformed history.
Mm-hmm.
But the founders were deeply, deeply theological men.
The source gives us tributes from leaders like John Broadus, James P. Boyce, and B.H. Carroll. Let's talk about Broadus first. He has this fantastic line about people who sneer at Calvinism.
It's a great line. He says, the people who sneer at what is called Calvinism might as well sneer at Mont Blanc.
Mont Blanc, the highest, most massive mountain in the Alps.
Think about that imagery for a second. You can dislike a mountain. You can say it's too cold or too steep or you don't want to climb it, but you can't just sneeze at it. You can't dismiss it.
It's just there. It's massive. It's undeniable.
And Broadus is saying that this system of theology is like that. You can disagree with it, but you can't dismiss it as something trivial or simplistic. It commands respect by its very size and its intellectual coherence.
And Broadus makes a linguistic argument too, doesn't he? He brings in the Apostle Paul and Calvin.
He does. He says that if you really, truly understand the Greek of the Apostle Paul and the Latin of John Calvin, you have to admit that they are teaching the same substance.
So it's not that you have to agree with every single action Calvin took as a civic leader in Geneva.
No, Broadus is clear on that. But theologically, he's saying Calvin is just systematizing Paul. He's taking the raw data of Scripture and organizing it into a coherent whole.
And he also notes that this theology tends to attract a certain kind of mind. He says it compels an earnest student to thinking.
That's a key observation, I think. Broadus believed that Calvinism, by its very nature, forces you to think deeply. It's not a shallow, feel-good theology. It makes you grapple with the biggest questions in the universe: God's ultimate purpose, eternity, the nature of the human will.
He says it makes him at home among the most inspiring and ennobling views of God.
Yes. It elevates the mind because it elevates God.
Then you have James P. Boyce, who was another one of the founders of the Southern Baptist Seminary, and he's very specific about the doctrine of election.
Boyce is rock solid here. He states with absolute clarity that God saves a definite number of people, not because of any foreseen faith or merit in them, but solely from his own good pleasure.
It's that phrase, his own good pleasure, that's the anchor for these Southern Baptist founders, isn't it?
It is. It locates the ultimate cause of salvation, not in man's ability or man's choice, but in God's freedom and God's will.
Which is a perfect transition to a more modern voice that the source material brings in, someone who really picks up that banner of God's pleasure and God's glory. John Piper.
Yes. The source cites a 1997 address that Piper gave. And Piper zeroes in on something that I think is the absolute key to unlocking Calvin's heart and mind.
What's that?
He argues that the root of Calvin's quarrel with Rome, his fundamental disagreement, wasn't just about justification by faith or the Mass or the role of the priesthood.
Those were the symptoms, not the disease.
Exactly. The root cause, the disease itself, was the obscuring of the majesty of the glory of God.
He talks about that famous letter to Cardinal Sadolet. Can you set that up for us? Who was Sadolet?
Cardinal Sadolet was a high-ranking, very smooth Catholic official who wrote a letter to the city of Geneva after Calvin had been kicked out. He was trying to woo them back into the fold of the Catholic Church. It was a very polite, very persuasive, very diplomatic letter.
And the city council in Geneva, they didn't know how to answer it, so they asked the guy they just exiled to write a response?
They did. And Calvin's response is a masterpiece. And Piper notes that Calvin's main critique isn't just procedural or about this doctrine or that one. It's that Rome has, over centuries, systematically obscured the glory of God.
How so?
By putting things in the way. By putting saints and Mary and the Pope and human merit in between the sinner and the immediate stunning glory of God in the face of Christ.
Piper suggests a banner that should hang over Calvin's entire life and work.
Yes. And that banner reads, "Zeal to illustrate the glory of God."
I think it was B.B. Warfield who said that no man ever had a deeper sense of God than John Calvin.
And Piper is echoing that. He argues that for Calvin, the fundamental problem with the world, and specifically with false religion, is that the excellence of Christ is not perceived by us. When the center of gravity shifts from God to man, everything falls apart.
So, for Piper, Calvin is not just a theologian of cold, hard logic. He's a theologian of white-hot majesty. He was recovering a passion for the absolute reality of God.
And that passion fueled his entire ministry, especially his preaching. And there's this famous story, and honestly, it's one of my favorites in all of church history, about Calvin's return to Geneva.
1541. Set the scene for us.
Okay, so Calvin had been exiled, kicked out of the city in 1538 because he and the city council clashed over church discipline. He goes to Strasbourg. He has a happy and productive 3 years. He gets married. He pastors a church of French refugees. He's content.
He doesn't want to go back.
He absolutely does not want to go back. In the meantime, Geneva falls into political and religious chaos, and they beg him to return. He says he would rather die 1,000 deaths than go back to that cross. But he goes because he believes it's God's will for his life.
So he walks back into that pulpit at St. Peter's Cathedral. The whole city is holding its breath. What is he going to say? I mean, they're expecting him to blast them.
Of course. I told you so. You ungrateful wretches, look at the mess you've made.
Or maybe, recount the story of his unjust exile and vindicate himself.
Right. Instead, Calvin gets up, opens his Bible, and resumes his expositional preaching at the exact verse he had left off at 3 years earlier.
Next verse.
Next verse. Not a word about himself, not a word about the past 3 years, just the Word of God. It sends a chill down your spine when you think about it.
So what's the message in that single action? What was he communicating?
Piper analyzes this beautifully. It shows this absolute refusal to let human events, human drama, dictate the message of God. It doesn't matter that he was exiled. It doesn't matter that they treated him badly. The word of God is a lamp that must not be suppressed. It just continues on, uninterrupted.
It also says so much about his philosophy of the pulpit. He had what the source calls a horror of preachers who brought their own dreams and fancies into the pulpit.
That's the phrase, dreams and fancies. Calvin believed that continuous exposition, just going verse by verse, chapter by chapter, book by book through the Bible, was the only safeguard. It forces the preacher to deal with what God actually says, not what the preacher feels like saying that week.
Right. If you just skip around and pick your favorite texts, you end up riding your own hobby horses over and over again.
But if you go verse by verse, you have to deal with the hard stuff, the confusing stuff, the stuff that challenges your own ideas, because it's right there in the text. You can't avoid it.
And Piper says this is why preaching will never die. Because as long as God is the great I am, as long as he is this majestic reality, people will have a deep hunger for that kind of expository exaltation.
It all connects back to the majesty. If God is that big, you don't just chat about him from the pulpit. You herald him. You proclaim him.
Let's move on to section 3, the Anglican view. And this might surprise some people because the Anglican Church is often seen as a via media, a middle way between Protestantism and Catholicism. But the source material highlights two huge figures, J.I. Packer and J.C. Ryle.
And Packer makes a massive claim, just a huge claim. He says that for a full century, basically from the mid-16th to the mid-17th century, John Calvin was the world's most influential man.
Not just in the church, in the world.
In the world. Packer argues that you cannot explain modern Britain or Europe or America without understanding him. His ideas, Packer says, made more history than anyone else alive at the time.
Packer calls him God's man for a crisis.
He does. And he draws this parallel between 1564, the year Calvin died, and 1964, the year Packer was writing.
Yeah.
And honestly, you could easily say it applies to today as well.
What's the parallel?
He talks about global unrest, the denigration of Christian civilization, widespread religious confusion. He sees his own time as a time of turmoil, just like Calvin's.
And in the middle of all that confusion, what does Calvin offer? What's the remedy?
It's the vision of God. Packer comes right back to that central theme of majesty. He cites Psalm 93. The Lord reigns. He is robed in majesty. Packer says this one verse is the sum of Calvinistic confidence. It's the vision of God on the throne, ruling over all things.
Packer was heavily influenced by B.B. Warfield on this point, wasn't he?
He was. He quotes Warfield's definition of a Calvinist, which is just beautiful. Warfield says a Calvinist is simply a man who has seen God.
Not a man who has mastered a logical system, but a man who has seen God.
Exactly. And having seen God in his glory, he is filled on the one hand with a profound sense of his own unworthiness and sinfulness, and on the other hand with adoring wonder that this glorious God would save sinners like him.
So it's not about being a dour, angry, argumentative debater. It's about being a man who has been humbled and overwhelmed by a vision of God.
Precisely. And that brings us to J.C. Ryle, the great evangelical bishop of Liverpool in the late 19th century. Ryle was a fighter. He was constantly fighting for the evangelical soul of the Church of England.
And he points specifically to the 39 Articles. For our listeners who might not be familiar, what are the 39 Articles?
They are the official confession of faith for the Church of England. It's their doctrinal standard, their statement of what they believe. And Ryle zeroes in on Article 17, which is specifically on the doctrine of predestination and election.
And what's his argument?
He's challenging the people of his day who are trying to argue that election is just a Presbyterian thing or a Baptist thing, but not an Anglican thing. Ryle basically says, have you read your own prayer book? Look at your own confession. He calls Article 17 one of the sheet anchors of sound doctrine.
He argues that Calvinistic divinity is the divinity of the Bible, of Augustine, and of the 39 Articles.
He does. He's claiming it as the historic mainstream position of his own church. And he uses very, very strong language to defend it.
The perish and go to pieces line.
Yes. He says the Church of England had better perish and go to pieces than forsake the foundational principles of the Protestant Reformation.
That is some serious intensity. He really believed that without these doctrines, the church would lose its very reason for existing.
He did. He even defended a book by Augustus Toplady, who was the guy who wrote the hymn Rock of Ages. Toplady wrote a book called Historic Proof that was just a mountain of evidence showing that the early Anglican reformers and divines were all Calvinists.
And what did Ryle say about that book?
Ryle says that book has never been answered for the simple reason that it is unanswerable. The historical evidence is just too overwhelming.
It's fascinating to see how integrated Calvin was into the Anglican identity for someone like Ryle. It wasn't some alien intrusion. For him, it was the bedrock of his church.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's widen the net even further. Section 4 covers independents and Methodists. And we can start with a modern independent, John MacArthur.
MacArthur's a great example of that same expository tradition we talked about with Piper. He's known for his verse-by-verse preaching through the entire New Testament.
And the source notes a couple of personal tributes from him. He has a grandson named Calvin.
That's a pretty clear tribute, isn't it?
It is. And he also mentions that he owns a 1599 Geneva Bible.
The Bible of the Puritans and the Pilgrims. And it wasn't just scripture. The Geneva Bible had the scripture, a prayer book, and the Psalms for singing, all bound together in one volume. It was for life, not just for study.
MacArthur also makes a really important point about the relationship between theology and praise, theology and worship.
He does. He says, the depth of theology creates the height of praise. This is such a crucial point. If your theology is shallow, if your view of God is small and sentimental, your praise will be shallow too. It might be loud, it might be emotional, but it won't be high. It won't have weight.
So Calvin's sense of God's glory led directly to a high and weighty form of praise.
And MacArthur attributes that directly to Calvin's relentless exposition of the text. It wasn't just his systematic theology, his institutes. It was the day in, day out digging into the text that produced that vision of God.
Now, moving to the Methodists, we come to Martin Lloyd-Jones, the doctor.
The doctor, a Welshman, originally a brilliant medical doctor who left a promising career in medicine to become one of the greatest preachers of the 20th century.
And the source highlights a famous address he gave on the BBC in 1944.
Think about the context. 1944. The world is at war. D-Day had just happened. London had been bombed relentlessly during the Blitz. The world was, to use his phrase, shaking in its foundations. And in the middle of all that, Martin Lloyd-Jones goes on the national radio to talk about Orn Calvin.
It seems like an odd choice of topic for that moment.
It does, but not for him. He notes that for a long time before this, Calvin's reputation had taken a nosedive. He was viewed as a monstrosity in a dank museum, a cruel, hard, unfeeling person. Lloyd-Jones wanted to correct that caricature.
And he does it by comparing Luther and Calvin, the volcano analogy.
A volcano analogy, so helpful. He called Luther a volcano. Luther was this explosive force of nature, spewing out fiery, brilliant, world-changing ideas in all directions. But Lloyd-Jones says ideas can't live without a body. They're just sparks. They need a structure.
Yeah.
And Calvin was the one who took all those fiery sparks of the Reformation and gave them a body, a coherent, logical, durable system in his Institutes of the Christian Religion.
He systematized the explosion. He gave it a form that could last.
And Lloyd-Jones then uses this incredible phrase. He calls the Institutes the iron ration of the soul.
Iron ration. We need to stop right there. What exactly is an iron ration?
It's a military term from that era. An iron ration is the emergency food supply a soldier carries in his pack for the absolute worst-case scenario. It's usually canned meat, maybe some hard biscuits. It's not gourmet. It's not tasty. It's not meant to be enjoyed.
It's meant to keep you alive.
It is dense, and it keeps you alive when the regular supply lines are cut, when you're surrounded by the enemy, when everything else has failed.
So why does he call Calvin's theology an iron ration?
Because when the bombs are literally falling on your city, as they were in 1944, or when you're facing being burned at the stake as the Protestant martyrs were, you don't need theological cotton candy. You don't need fluff. You need to know, down in your bones, that God is sovereign. You need to know that not a single hair can fall from your head without his permission. That is the iron ration. It keeps your soul alive in the worst imaginable conditions.
That is a hauntingly beautiful and incredibly powerful description. It connects this high theology directly to human survival in times of crisis.
It does. Lloyd-Jones said this theology was the food for the martyrs, for the pilgrims on the Mayflower, for the Covenanters in Scotland. It's what gave them the spiritual backbone to stand when everything was telling them to fall.
Lloyd-Jones also touched on the political and social aspect of this, didn't he?
He did. He argued that Calvin's teaching is the basis for true order and discipline in society, without descending into tyranny. On the one hand, no king has a divine right to tyrannize his people, but on the other hand, liberty doesn't mean license. There must be order.
Now, we can't talk about Methodists without addressing the elephant in the room, the honest opponent.
John Wesley.
Wesley, the father of Methodism, the great Arminian champion. You'd expect him to just despise Calvin.
You would. But the source material shows he had a much more nuanced view.
He did. Wesley openly admitted that Calvin was a great instrument of God and a wise and pious man. He disagreed with him on key points, but he respected him.
And he gave some very specific advice to his followers about the Servetus affair. For listeners who don't know, Michael Servetus was a heretic who was executed for blasphemy in Geneva, and it's often used as a club to beat Calvin with, personally.
And what was Wesley's advice?
He told his followers to let Servetus alone. Basically, don't use that historical tragedy as a cheap rhetorical attack unless you have taken the time to understand the full historical context of the 16th century. That shows a lot of intellectual integrity on Wesley's part.
It really does.
And he leveled the playing field between the two theological camps. He said that at the end of the day, Arminians and Calvinists are just upon a level. He acknowledged that good, pious, learned people could be found on both sides. He disagreed strongly on predestination, absolute versus conditional, but he didn't unchurch Calvin. He respected the man's piety and his work for God.
That brings us to our final section, unexpected tributes and the broader cultural impact. And here we're going way outside the normal Protestant camp.
We are. The source mentions a Lutheran theologian named Valentine André visiting Geneva and just being blown away by the moral order of the city. He called it a perfect institution of a perfect republic.
But the real surprise is the Roman Catholic scholar Alexander Ganassi.
Right, and he uses this fascinating musical analogy to describe Calvin's work.
How does he put it?
He views Calvin as a great composer. He says Calvin took themes from earlier reformers, from Luther, from Zwingli, from Bucer-like musical motifs, and then he orchestrated them into his own grand personal composition.
So he wasn't just copying them. He was arranging their best ideas into a coherent symphony.
That's the idea. And Ganassi, a Catholic scholar, freely admits that Calvin was superior to Luther in his documentation, his structure, his sheer architectural genius. The intellectual power is undeniable, even to an opponent.
And finally, let's circle back to the political angle. We touched on this with Lloyd Jones, but the source mentions the skeptic David Hume and the historian George Bancroft.
And this is a point that often gets lost. David Hume was a philosopher, an Enlightenment skeptic, an atheist, essentially. He was no friend to Christianity, yet he admitted that the English Constitution owes its very liberty to the Puritans.
And who were the Puritans?
Overwhelmingly, they were Calvinists.
And George Bancroft, the American historian, explains why. He describes Calvinism as being rooted in predestination, which earthly monarchs feared because they saw it as republicanism in disguise.
The logic is just fascinating when you unpack it. If you believe that you have a charter from the King of Kings, if you believe your name is written in the Lamb's Book of Life from before the foundation of the world, that becomes your ultimate title of nobility.
So you don't need to bow and scrape before an earthly aristocrat or a king.
Exactly. You have a direct standing before the God of the universe. Your identity is secure in eternity. This radically levels the social and political playing field.
So, in a strange and wonderful way, the doctrine of election, which so many people today think is restrictive or unfair, was actually the engine of political liberty in the West.
You're right. It destroyed the idea of the divine right of kings by establishing the far more radical idea of the divine rights of God over all people equally.
Wow. Okay, let's try to synthesize this deep dive. We've traveled from Spurgeon's London to Broadus's Kentucky, from Piper's Minneapolis to Packer's Oxford, and all the way back to 16th century Geneva.
The common thread, it seems to me, is crystal clear. Whether it was Spurgeon kissing that medal, or J.C. Ryle defending the 39 Articles, or Lloyd Jones preaching during the Blitz, they all saw the same thing in Calvin.
And it wasn't just a system of logic.
No. They saw a man who was utterly consumed by the majesty of God.
It always comes back to that, doesn't it? The sheer weight and reality of God.
It does. For all these different figures, for all these different traditions, Calvin's theology wasn't an abstract intellectual game. It was a life-altering vision of God on the throne. And that vision provided the iron ration that sustained people through crisis, through doubt, and through history.
So here's a final provocative thought for you, the listener. We live in a time that feels a lot like the times that Packer and Lloyd Jones describe. Confused, shaking, uncertain.
If so many diverse voices, Baptists, Anglicans, Methodists, Independents, found their stability, their spiritual food, their iron ration in this theology during their own crises, what might we be missing if we dismiss it or ignore it today?
If John Piper is right, and preaching will never die because the human hunger for God's majesty is eternal, then maybe it's time for us to blow the dust off those old commentaries and see that majesty for ourselves.
Or at the very least, like Spurgeon advised his students, not be afraid to put an extra lump of sugar in the tea now and then.
I love that. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the surprising legacy of John Calvin. We hope it has challenged you, encouraged you, and maybe even surprised you a little.
It certainly has been a great discussion.
Until next time, keep thinking and keep looking at the majesty of God. Goodbye.